The restraints clicked shut around my wrists before I even finished sitting down. Cold metal, cold room, cold light pouring down from somewhere above me, white and flat, the kind of light that makes you feel like evidence instead of a person. Subject secured, a voice said, somewhere outside the glass. I flexed my fingers inside the cuffs. They didn't hurt, not yet. That was the part nobody mentioned about tests like this. The hurting always came later, dressed up as something else first. Ren Ashby, the voice continued. Human, age 19, volunteer status. That's me, I said, mostly to hear my own voice in the room. It sounded steadier than I felt, which I counted as a small win. The voice belonged to a woman watching me through a wall of glass, 2 floors up, behind a panel of soft blue light and slow blinking instruments. Dr. Leora Sene. I'd met her 20 minutes earlier, in a hallway that smelled like recycled air and something faintly metallic, like a coin held too long in a closed fist. She had pale gray skin, eyes a shade of violet I'd never seen on anything alive, and a voice that stayed level no matter what she said. She'd shaken my hand like she wasn't sure human hands were built for shaking. This facility runs the standard coalition diagnostic, she'd told me. 100 hours. No subject has completed it. What happens to the ones who don't? They stop, she said. Just that. No elaboration. I decided not to ask what stopping looked like. Now, strapped into a chair built for a body shape that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite anything else either, I watched the temperature display above the door tick downward. 21 degrees, 18, 14. Beginning phase 1, Senna said. Cold exposure, baseline vitals. The room kept dropping. 10 degrees, 5. My breath started showing in front of my face, small white clouds that drifted up and disappeared into the white light. I thought about my brother. That was the deal. That was the whole reason I was sitting in a chair built by people who didn't sleep, in a station orbiting a planet I couldn't pronounce the name of, freezing on purpose. Caleb was 12 years old and dying slowly of something Earth doctors didn't have the tools to fix, and the Coalition did, and the price of that fix was proving my species wasn't a threat. 100 hours, that was all. Then Caleb got his treatment, whether I made it or not. That part had been written into the contract in language so careful it almost sounded kind. 0 degrees now. The restraints had a thin layer of frost on them. Subject heart rate is elevated, said a second voice, younger, male, slightly nervous in a way the first voice wasn't. 88 beats per minute. That's normal for stress onset, Sen replied. It was 91 a minute ago. It's dropping, Sen said. Keep watching. I didn't know they could see that. I didn't know my heart rate was something other people got to watch like a sports score. It should have bothered me more than it did. Instead, I found myself doing the thing I always did when things got bad enough to need handling. I picked something small and useless to focus on. A scuff mark on the floor, shaped almost like a comma. I stared at it until the room stopped feeling so much like a freezer and started feeling like a room with a scuff mark in it. -10 degrees. My fingers had gone from cold to something past cold. A kind of distant ringing numbness that didn't quite reach pain. Subject is not shivering, the younger voice said. Why isn't she shivering? She was, Sen said. 90 seconds ago, it stopped. That's not in the expected range. No, Senny agreed. It isn't. I wanted to tell them shivering was a waste of energy once your body figured out it wasn't going to warm you up fast enough to matter. I'd learned that on a mountain road outside what used to be called Denver, 3 years before the Coalition ships ever showed up in our sky. Back when the worst thing in my life was weather and not aliens deciding whether my species deserved medicine. But I didn't have the breath to spare on explaining myself to a glass wall, so I just kept staring at the comma-shaped scuff and counted my own heartbeat instead, slow and steady, like counting something familiar in the dark. The cold bottomed out at -20 and held there for what felt like a very long time and was, according to the clock blinking red above the door, exactly 4 minutes. Phase 1 complete, Senna said, restoring ambient temperature. The room warmed in stages, careful ones, like they didn't want to shock a system they'd just finished freezing. I felt my fingers come back first, prickling hard enough to make my eyes water, then my arms, then the rest of me, all at once. A wave of heat that felt almost as uncomfortable as the cold had. Subject vitals stabilizing, the younger voice reported. He sounded relieved. I appreciated that, even if he wasn't the one who'd had to sit through it. Noah, Sen said. Pull the comparison data. Species log 7 through 14. A pause. Keys clicking somewhere I couldn't see. All 7 previous subjects showed full physiological shutdown by the 2-minute mark of phase 1, Noah said. Loss of consciousness in 5 of 7. Cardiac irregularity in the other 2. And subject 8? Another pause. I realized, slowly, that subject 8 was me. I didn't have a name in their system yet. I was a number with a heartbeat attached. Conscious, Noah said. Vitals within 10% of baseline. Nobody said anything for a moment. I could hear the soft hum of the climate system working to push the room back to something livable, and underneath that, very faint, the sound of someone tapping a pen against a desk, fast, like a nervous habit they hadn't noticed yet. "Run it again," said a third voice. Deeper, flatter, a voice that sounded like it had never once had to ask permission for anything in its life. Phase 1, full duration this time, not 4 minutes, 10. Director Voss, Senni said, and something in her tone shifted, went careful in a different way than before. Phase 1 protocol specifies 4 minutes for human baseline subjects based on Earth's recorded climate data. Earth's recorded climate data was provided by Earth, Voss said. I'd like a number we didn't get from the people being tested. I couldn't see him. I didn't need to. I'd met men like that my whole life, the kind who decided what you were worth before you'd said a single word, and then spent the rest of the conversation looking for proof they'd been right all along. 10 minutes, Voss said again, like repeating it made it less of a request. There was a long pause. I watched the number above the door. 21 degrees. Holding. Waiting. Understood, Senni said finally, and I heard something underneath the word that I couldn't name yet, something that wasn't quite agreement. The temperature began to drop again. I closed my eyes for a second, just one, and thought about Caleb's hands. He had small hands, even for a 12-year-old, and a habit of drumming his fingers against his knee when he got nervous about something, which back home had mostly been thunderstorms and exam results and, near the end, his own breathing. I thought about the sound those fingers made against denim. I held on to that sound, the way I'd learned to hold on to small, useless things when the big things got too heavy to carry directly. -5. -10. Subject heart rate, Noah said, and his voice had gone tight again. 82 and falling. Falling, Sen repeated, like she wanted to be sure she'd heard it right. It's not panicking, Noah said. It's calming down. -15. The frost on the restraints had thickened into something closer to ice, fine white crystals catching the overhead light and throwing it back in small, cold sparks. I thought about the scuff mark on the floor, but I couldn't see it through the haze starting to build at the edges of my vision, so I thought about the comma shape instead. Just the idea of it. A small, curved thing holding a sentence together so it wouldn't run away from itself. -20. The clock held there, and held, and held. 6 minutes, Noah said. His voice had stopped sounding nervous and started sounding something closer to afraid, though not of me, of the numbers, of what the numbers meant. Subject is conscious, Sen said, quiet, mostly to herself, like she was confirming something she didn't quite believe, even while reading it off a screen in front of her. 8 minutes. My jaw had locked somewhere around minute 5, and I hadn't noticed until I tried to unclench it and found I couldn't. My breath had stopped showing as clouds and started feeling like it wasn't moving at all, just sitting in my chest, heavy and slow, waiting for permission. 10 minutes. The lights flickered once, then steadied, and the temperature display began climbing again, faster this time, like even the room itself wanted the test over. Phase 1 complete, Senni said, and her voice had a small crack in it that hadn't been there an hour ago, thin as a hairline fracture in glass, the kind you only notice if you're looking for it. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. I sat there, jaw aching, fingers burning back to life one slow inch at a time, and listened to the silence on the other side of the glass stretch out longer than any silence should. "Director," Senni said eventually. "I'd like that noted in the official log. 10 minutes. Full consciousness maintained." "Noted," Voss said, and something underneath his flat voice had changed too, though I couldn't have told you what, not yet, not from where I was sitting. "Subject 8, Noah said, half to himself, half to the room, like he was trying the words out to see if they made any more sense out loud than they had in his head. 96 hours to go." I almost laughed. It came out instead as something closer to a cough, raw from the cold air I'd been breathing for 10 straight minutes, but it was a laugh underneath it, the kind that shows up when your body needs somewhere safe to put the leftover fear. "Looking forward to it," I said, and my voice barely shook at all. Through the glass, I thought I saw Dr. Sen lean forward slightly, just an inch, the way people do when they're trying to get a closer look at something that doesn't match the picture they were given. I didn't know yet that I was about to spend the next 4 days breaking every chart in that station. I didn't know about the despair engine, or the false alarm that would send me straight back to a road outside Denver I hadn't thought about in years, or the notebook Dr. Senni would start keeping in secret because the official records weren't telling the truth fast enough for her. All I knew, sitting there with frost melting off my eyelashes and my brother's name held quiet behind my teeth, was that I had 96 hours left, and I intended to use every single one of them, proving I could still be standing at the end. The clock above the door reset itself, glowing a steady, patient red. Phase 2 began 2 minutes later, and it didn't give me time to catch my breath first. They moved me to a different room for Phase 2, one without a chair, without restraints, without much of anything except 4 walls painted a gray so flat it seemed to swallow the light instead of reflecting it. Isolation and pressure testing, Sen's voice said through a speaker I couldn't see. No physical contact, no conversation, except where instructed. What counts as instructed? I asked. A pause. I'll let you know. The door sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath being let out. I stood in the middle of the room and turned in a slow circle, because there wasn't much else to do, and because moving felt better than standing still in a space built to feel like nothing. No windows, no clock, no sound except the faint hiss of air moving through vents I couldn't locate. I reached up and touched the hairpin tucked behind my ear, an old habit, something I'd done 1,000 times without thinking about it. It had been Caleb's once, technically, a cheap metal thing shaped like a tiny lightning bolt that he'd won at a county fair and given to me because he said lightning bolts were a girl thing, not a boy thing, which had never made sense to either of us but had become a joke between us anyway. I clicked it against my back tooth, twice, the way I always did when a room got too quiet for comfort. Subject is exhibiting a repetitive motion, Noah's voice said, somewhere on the other side of the wall. Hand to ear. Should I log it as anxiety behavior? Log it as a baseline habit, Sen said. Not every motion is a symptom. I appreciated that more than I let on. I clicked the pin again anyway. The pressure started slowly. So slowly I almost didn't notice it at first. A change in my ears, a faint tightness behind my eyes, like riding an elevator in a very tall building. Then it kept building, past where elevators usually stopped, into something that made my skull feel like it was being measured for a smaller size. Pressure increasing to 4 atmospheres, Sene said. Report any discomfort verbally. Define discomfort, I said, and my own voice sounded strange to me, thinner, pressed flat by the air around it. Pain, disorientation, difficulty breathing. All 3, a little, I admitted. There wasn't much point lying about something they could already measure better than I could feel it. Continuing, she said. 5 atmospheres, 6. My ears popped twice in a row, sharp enough to make my eyes water, and the room seemed to tilt slightly even though I knew, somewhere underneath the dizziness, that it hadn't actually moved. I focused on the hairpin instead. Click, click, against my tooth. A small, useless motion that gave the rest of me somewhere to put the discomfort instead of carrying it all at once. Subject's biometric stress markers are climbing, Noah said, but her breathing rate isn't matching them. It's almost like 2 separate readings. Explain, Voss said, and I hadn't realized he was back in the room until his voice cut through, flat as ever. Her body's reacting like something hurts, Noah said, but her breathing's staying controlled, like she's choosing it, on purpose. Under this kind of pressure, that shouldn't be possible. Then she's lying about the pain, Voss said. I'm not, I said, loud enough that I knew they'd hear it clearly even through whatever was squeezing the air in that room down to something thick and difficult. Hurts plenty. I'm just not going to let it pick what my lungs do next. Silence, for a moment, on the other side of the wall. Then Sene's voice again, quieter than before. Where did you learn to do that? I almost answered with a joke. That was the easy thing, the thing that came naturally, deflecting with something light enough to keep the conversation moving past wherever it was trying to go. But something about the way she'd asked it, careful, genuinely curious, not like an interrogation, made me answer honestly instead. Storm cellar, I said. When I was 8, power went out, ceiling started groaning. My mom told me to count my breaths instead of counting the noise. Worked then. Still works. 8 atmospheres, she said, like she hadn't quite processed what I'd just told her. Or had processed it and didn't know what to do with it yet. The pressure kept climbing. My vision narrowed at the edges, soft and gray, like looking down a long hallway with the lights slowly going out one by one. 9, Noah said, voice tight. I clicked the hairpin against my tooth and thought about thunder. Not the bad kind. The kind that used to roll over our farmhouse roof for a full 10 seconds before it ever cracked. Long enough that Caleb and I would lie on the porch and count the gap between the flash and the sound, pretending it told us how far away the storm was, even though neither of us actually remembered the formula right. 10 atmospheres. The room blurred entirely for a second, gray sliding into something closer to black, my knees buckling slightly before I caught myself against the wall. That's the threshold, Sen said, sharp now, urgent in a way she hadn't been before. Director, that's the documented threshold for unconsciousness in species of her density and lung capacity. Continue the test, Voss said. She's at the edge of the safety parameter. The parameter was set using data from 7 other species, Voss said, none of which behaved like this one. I want to know where her actual edge is, not where ours assumes it should be. There was a pause, longer this time, heavy enough that I could feel it even through the fog pressing in around my thoughts. 11, Sene said finally, and I heard the reluctance in it, a kind of strain that hadn't been part of her voice an hour ago. My knees gave out fully this time. I went down onto one, then both, palms flat against the cold floor, the hairpin slipping loose from behind my ear and clattering somewhere out of reach. I reached for it anyway, fingers scraping uselessly against smooth gray flooring, because losing that stupid little lightning bolt felt, in that moment, like the worst thing that could possibly happen. Worse than the pressure folding my chest in on itself. Worse than the gray closing in at the edges of everything. She's reaching for something, Noah said. Floor item. It fell. Ignore it, Voss said. I can't, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Smaller than I'd let it get in front of strangers and longer than I could remember. Please, just let me get it. There was a beat of silence. Then, unexpectedly, Sene's voice, low enough that I almost thought it wasn't meant for the official record at all. 12 seconds, she said, pressure pausing. Take what you need. I crawled the half-foot it took to reach the hairpin, fingers closing around it like it was something that mattered more than oxygen, and pressed it back behind my ear with hands that had started, finally, to shake. Resume, Voss said, the moment the 12 seconds ran out, like he'd been counting them down somewhere just for the satisfaction of cutting them off exactly on time. The pressure climbed past 11 atmospheres, into a territory the readouts apparently didn't have a clean number for, judging by the long pause before Noah spoke again. 12.3, he said. She's still conscious. That's not possible, Voss said, and for the first time something in his flat voice cracked open just slightly, not into worry, but into something closer to disbelief, refusing to be disbelief. I didn't have breath left to answer him. I knelt there on the gray floor with my hand pressed against my ear like I could hold the hairpin in place through sheer will, counting heartbeats instead of breaths, because breaths had stopped being something I could promise myself reliably. And somewhere in the haze, I thought about Caleb's hands drumming against his knee, and held onto that instead of letting go of anything else. The pressure finally broke at 12.8, the room releasing all at once in a rush of equalizing air that knocked the last of my balance sideways, sending me fully down onto the cold floor, cheek against gray, lungs pulling in air so fast it hurt going down. Phase 2 complete, Sene said, and her voice had lost whatever careful distance it started the test with. It sounded, for just a second, almost shaken. I lay there a while, not moving, listening to my own heartbeat slow back down to something that resembled normal. The hairpin had stayed in place. I counted that as the only victory in the room worth claiming out loud, even if only to myself. Get her water, Senmei said, somewhere above me. The words clipped and fast in a way that suggested she was talking to someone other than me. Now, before Phase 3. There's a mandatory rest interval before Phase 3, Noah said, though it came out more like a question than a fact. There is, Sene said. 30 minutes. I'm not skipping it regardless of what the director wants logged. Nobody argued with her. I noticed that, even half-conscious on a cold floor, nobody argued. A door hissed open somewhere to my left, and a moment later a small cup of water appeared on the floor near my hand, delivered by something that looked like a thin mechanical arm rather than a person. I pulled myself upright slowly, drank it in 3 long swallows, and pressed my palm flat against the floor to steady the last of the shaking in my arms. Ren, Sene's voice said, quieter now, closer to the glass than before, like she'd stepped right up against it to say my actual name instead of my subject number for the first time since I'd arrived. That cellar, when you were 8, was that the only time? I thought about lying. It would have been easy, and it would have kept the conversation small and manageable, the way I preferred most conversations about my own history to stay. No, I said instead, not the only time. She didn't push for more. I gave her credit for that, sitting there on the floor with my pulse finally settling and 30 minutes standing between me and whatever Phase 3 turned out to be. Get some rest, she said. You'll need it. I closed my eyes, hairpin secure behind my ear, and didn't sleep, not really, but let the half-dark behind my eyelids carry me somewhere quieter for a while, somewhere that wasn't gray walls and pressure readouts and a director's flat voice asking for numbers nobody human had ever been measured against before. 30 minutes, I told myself, then 94 hours left. I'd survived worse math than that, once. A small panel slid open near the floor before I'd even finished the thought, and a folded square of fabric pushed through, gray like everything else in that station, except this one had something tucked inside it. I unfolded it slowly. A strip of dried fruit, the kind that came in foil packets in the station mess hall, the kind nobody official would have authorized for a subject mid-diagnostic. That wasn't me, Noah said quickly, before I could even ask. Officially. Unofficially? Unofficially. You looked like you needed something that wasn't water. I almost smiled. It felt strange on my face, like a muscle I hadn't used in a few hours, stiff from disuse. Thanks, Noah. There was a pause, the kind that told me he hadn't expected me to use his name, hadn't expected to be anything other than a voice in a control room to the thing breathing hard on the other side of the glass. You're not what the file said you'd be, he admitted. What did the file say? That Deathworld species tend toward aggression under stress, unpredictable, possibly violent. A pause. You're just stubborn. Where I'm from, those might be the same thing, I said, and ate the dried fruit slowly, savoring it the way you save the good part of a meal for last, because I didn't know when the next kindness would show up, or whether it would be allowed to. Somewhere further off, I heard Voss's voice again, lower than before, talking to someone who wasn't Sene or Noah, a third presence in the control room I hadn't placed yet. I couldn't make out the words, just the shape of the conversation, clipped and urgent, the kind of tone people use when they've started planning around a problem instead of just observing it. I didn't like the sound of that, even muffled through a wall. I finished the fruit, folded the empty wrapper into a small square out of habit, and tucked it into my sleeve rather than leaving it on the floor for anyone to find. Old instinct. Leave no trace, even in places that already knew exactly where you were, and exactly what your heart rate was doing at every second. The 30 minutes ticked down slower than any 30 minutes I could remember, each one stretched thin by the not knowing of what Phase 3 would ask of me, and what that low, urgent conversation in the control room was deciding, while I sat there with a hairpin behind my ear, and my brother's voice held quiet in the back of my mind, waiting. Phase 3 started with a light that wouldn't turn off. They moved me to a third room, smaller than the last two, with a single bright panel set into the ceiling that buzzed faintly and never dimmed, not even a little, not even when I asked. Sleep deprivation and cognitive disruption testing, Sen said. Duration, 40 hours. You will not be permitted to sleep during this phase. 40 hours, I repeated, and something in my chest dropped slightly, the way it does when a number turns out to be bigger than you'd braced for. The previous longest recorded endurance for this phase, across all species tested, was 6 hours before full cognitive collapse, she said. I want you to understand the scale of what's being asked. Trying not to think about it too hard, I said, pun intended. There was a pause on the other end that might have been the closest thing to a laugh Seni allowed herself during working hours. The first few hours weren't bad, not really. I paced the small room, did slow exercises to keep my blood moving, talked to myself under my breath just to have something other than the buzzing light to listen to. I told the empty room stories about home, the porch with the storm counting, the way Caleb used to draw little lightning bolts on everything he owned after he gave me the hairpin, like he'd decided it was a family symbol now and nobody had voted on it but him. By hour 10, the light had started to feel less like light and more like a sound, a high, thin ringing just behind my eyes that didn't match anything actually being broadcast into the room. By hour 18, the walls had started doing something I knew, logically, they weren't actually doing. Breathing, very slowly, in and out, gray surfaces expanding and contracting like the whole room had lungs of its own. Subject's pupil response is showing early hallucination markers, Noah reported, somewhere far away and very close at the same time. Expected at this duration, Sen said. Continue monitoring. I sat down against the wall that wasn't actually breathing and pressed my palms flat against the floor, grounding myself the way you do when the version of reality your brain is offering stops matching the one your hands can still feel. Hour 24. I started hearing things that weren't on any speaker. Not voices exactly, not at first. Just a low rolling sound, distant, like thunder building up somewhere over a horizon I couldn't see. I knew it wasn't real. I told myself that, clearly, in words, the way you're supposed to when your brain starts inventing things to fill the silence. It didn't make the sound stop, it just made me aware, with perfect clarity, that I was hearing something my ears weren't actually receiving. There it is, I muttered, more to myself than to anyone listening. There's what? Seni asked. Storm, I said. Not a real one. Just, remembering one, loud. Describe it. I didn't, not at first. Some things don't shrink down well enough to fit through a comm channel without losing the parts that matter, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hand this particular memory over to a room full of people taking notes on it. The thunder kept rolling. By hour 28 it had grown teeth, sharp ones, cracking close enough that I flinched without meaning to, my whole body jerking sideways before my mind caught up, and reminded me the room was silent except for the buzzing light and my own ragged breathing. Heart rate spike, Noah said. Significant. She just reacted to something that isn't there. Hold position, Seni said. Don't intervene yet. I pressed the back of my head against the wall and breathed through it, counting the way my mother taught me in a storm cellar 11 years ago. 4 in, 4 held, 4 out, 4 held, A square of breath I traced over and over until the imaginary thunder rolled itself back out past the imaginary horizon and left me alone again with the buzzing light and the slow, breathing walls. Hour 34. The alarm went off. It wasn't part of the test. I understood that much. Later, after the fact, after Sen's voice came through sharp and apologetic, explaining that a separate system fault on a different deck had triggered the station's general emergency siren by accident. An old warning tone that had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with Phase 3, nothing to do with anything, except bad timing, and a maintenance error 3 corridors away. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the sound, a rising, two-tone wail that cut through 40 hours of sleepless static straight down into something older and lower than conscious thought, something that didn't live in my head so much as in my spine, in the muscles of my legs, in the part of my body that had learned, a long time ago, exactly what that particular shape of sound meant. I was on the floor before I decided to move, flat, hands over the back of my neck, knees pulled tight, body curled small against the base of the wall, every part of me arranged in a position I hadn't consciously chosen, hadn't practiced in years, and still performed perfectly, instantly, the way you remember how to catch yourself falling even after a decade without doing it on purpose. Subject's down, Noah said, voice spiking with alarm. She just dropped, full collapse position. That's not collapse, Senny said, and I heard her stand up fast enough that something on a desk clattered. That's drop and cover. That's trained behavior. I stayed there, curled against the wall, counting the wail of the alarm in heartbeats instead of seconds, 4 counts per scream, the way I used to count between flash and thunder on a porch that didn't exist anymore. Somewhere underneath the counting, a different sound tried to surface, a memory with a shape I usually kept locked well below the part of my mind that did daily things like eating breakfast or making conversation, a road outside what used to be Denver, 3 years before any of this, before coalition ships, before diagnostic chambers, before any of it. A different kind of siren, a different kind of falling. I was thrown back 5 years, just like that, gone and back, the whole thing arriving and leaving inside the span of a single breath. The alarm cut off. Silence rushed back in so fast it felt like its own kind of noise, ringing in the space the siren left behind. I stayed curled against the wall a few seconds longer, waiting to be sure, the way you always wait a few extra seconds even after you know, logically, that it's over. Ren, Sen's voice said, very close to the glass, very quiet. That alarm was a false trigger, unrelated system fault. You're safe. I uncurled slowly, joint by joint, and sat back against the wall, breathing hard, the hairpin pressed against my ear where my hand had landed without me noticing. Guess that one's still loaded, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me more than the collapse position had. Nobody asked what I meant, nobody pushed. I appreciated that more than I had words for in that moment, sitting there with 40 hours of sleeplessness sitting heavy behind my eyes, and an old reflex still humming faintly in my legs. Somewhere around hour 38, before the alarm fully stopped echoing in my legs, a shape appeared in the corner of the room. I noticed it the way you notice things out of the edge of your vision, half-formed and easy to dismiss, except this one didn't dismiss easily. It stood the way a person stands, shoulders, a head, the suggestion of arms hanging loose at its sides. Someone's in here, I said, before I could stop myself. No one is in the room with you, Sene said. Careful. Immediate. Describe what you're seeing. Tall, I said, standing by the corner, not moving. I watched it for a long moment, my pulse climbing despite 40 hours of exhaustion telling my body to slow down, not speed up. The shape didn't shift. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, patient in a way that felt wrong, the kind of patience that belongs to things that aren't in any hurry because they already know how the scene ends. Then I noticed its feet weren't touching the floor. That was the first crack, a small one, just enough. It's not standing, I said slowly, working it out loud, the way you talk yourself down a ladder one rung at a time. It's hanging there, like it's stitched onto the wall instead of standing on the ground. Keep going, Sen said. I kept watching, and the shape, instead of resolving into something safer, did the opposite. It tilted its head at an angle no real neck allowed, slow and wrong, like a puppet experimenting with the limits of its own joints. My stomach dropped, cold and sudden, but I made myself keep cataloging it instead of looking away, because looking away from a thing your mind invented never actually made it leave, not in my experience. It only meant it found you again later, somewhere worse. It's not real, I said, mostly for myself. It's not real, it's not real. It doesn't have a face yet because I haven't decided what face scares me most, and I'm not going to decide. The shape held still another moment, and then, slowly, the way smoke gives up holding its shape once a window opens somewhere in the house, it thinned and folded back into the gray of the wall. gone the way it had come, without ceremony, without explanation. Subject's pupil dilation just normalized, Noah reported, somewhere behind the glass, his voice carrying open astonishment now instead of just clinical alarm. She talked herself out of it, in real time. I've never seen that documented before. Neither have I, Sen said, quiet. I sat with my back against the wall, breathing hard, hairpin pressed cold against my fingers, and didn't say anything else for a long while, because some victories don't need narrating out loud to count. It was Sen who broke the silence, eventually, her voice carrying a hesitation I hadn't heard from her before, like she was crossing a line she usually kept herself well clear of. What was it? She asked. The thing the alarm reminded you of. I considered not answering. It would have been easy enough, another deflection, another joke pointed sideways to slide the question off me without anyone noticing it had landed. But something about the way she'd asked, not clinical, not for the file, just quiet and human, in a way I hadn't expected from someone with violet eyes and gray skin, made me give her the truth, small as I could make it. Road collapse, I said, outside a city that doesn't exist on your maps anymore. I was 16. What happened? I survived, I said. That's the whole story you're getting today. There was a pause, and then, very softly, that's fair. I closed my eyes, just for a second, and let myself sit in the quiet a little longer. Hour 34 bleeding slowly into hour 35, the buzzing light still burning steady above me, the walls finally settling back into walls instead of something that breathed. Director wants Phase 3 extended, Noah said suddenly, voice low, like he wasn't sure he should be repeating it out loud. Says the false alarm compromised data integrity. Wants another 6 hours added to compensate. Absolutely not, Sen said, sharp enough that I startled slightly even through the haze. She just had an involuntary trauma response triggered by a system malfunction that wasn't even part of the test. Extending this phase now would be... I'm aware of what it would be. Voss's voice cut in, flat as ever, though something underneath it had shifted again. The same crack I'd noticed back in Phase 1, widening slightly each time. 6 hours. Documented as a data integrity correction. There was a long, taut silence. Fine, Sen said finally, and the word came out clipped, controlled in a way that told me exactly how much it cost her to say it. 6 hours. Logged under protest. I sat against the wall and did the math in my head, slow and careful, the way I'd been doing math since hour 1. 46 hours now in Phase 3 alone, on top of everything that had come before it, on top of everything still waiting after. I thought about Caleb's hands again, drumming against his knee, and held onto the sound of it the way you hold onto a rope when the water gets deep enough that your feet stop finding the bottom. 46 hours, I said out loud, mostly to hear something other than the buzzing light. Guess I'd better get comfortable. You're doing better than comfortable, Sene said, quiet, almost to herself. You're doing better than anything we've ever recorded. I didn't have an answer for that. I just leaned my head back against the wall, eyes open, fighting the slow pull of exhaustion with nothing but stubbornness and a hairpin shaped like a tiny lightning bolt, and waited for whatever came next. It came, eventually, in the form of Sene's voice again, hours later, hour 51 by my count, carrying a tightness I hadn't heard from her before, not even during the alarm. Phase 3 is complete, she said. There's a mandatory medical check before Phase 4 begins. They brought me to a small side room with a real bed in it, the first soft surface I'd seen in 51 hours, and a medical drone that hovered close enough to scan my vitals without ever quite touching me. I sat on the edge of the bed and let it work, too tired to do much else, my hands resting in my lap, the hairpin still tucked safely behind my ear, where it had stayed through everything the last 2 days had thrown at it. Sene came in herself, in person this time, no glass between us, dressed in the same pale uniform as before but with her shoulders set differently, less like a scientist reviewing a subject, and more like someone checking on another person. She looked at the readout floating above the drone, then at me, then back at the readout, like she was still trying to reconcile the two. Your cortisol levels should be catastrophic, she said. By every measure we have, you should not be sitting upright. Stubborn, I reminded her. Noah's word, not mine. A small, tired, almost smile crossed her face, there and gone fast enough that I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching for it. Eat this, she said, handing me a small ration bar wrapped in plain foil. No station markings. Nothing official about it at all. Off the record, you're going to get a reputation, I said, taking it anyway, unwrapping it with hands that had finally stopped shaking sometime in the last hour. I already have one, she said. Apparently I'm the scientist who can't stop checking on the human. I ate slowly, chewing through the dry, faintly sweet bar while she watched the drone's readout cycle through numbers I didn't understand, and she clearly did, her expression tightening with each new line that scrolled past. What's phase 4? I asked, when the silence had stretched long enough that I needed to fill it with something other than my own pulse in my ears, though some part of me already suspected the answer wasn't going to be one I liked. It's called the despair engine, she said. No subject has ever reached it conscious before. It isn't designed to be survived. It's designed to find the exact point where a mind decides to stop trying. Every species we've run it on has found that point within the first 2 hours. And the ones who found it? They don't come back from it the same, she said. Some don't come back from it at all. I sat with that for a long moment, the foil wrapper crumpled in my fist, my brother's hairpin warm against my ear from hours of body heat, and thought about how close I already was, how far I'd already come, how much of the math left to do still sat on the other side of a door I hadn't walked through yet. How long do I have before it starts? I asked. 4 hours, she said. Sleep, if you can. I lay back on the small bed, eyes open, staring at a ceiling that didn't buzz and didn't breathe and didn't hold anything in its corners pretending to be a person. And didn't sleep, not really, but let the quiet hold me for a while, gathering whatever strength 48 hours without rest had left scattered around inside me, because I had a feeling I was going to need every last scrap of it. They didn't tell me what the despair engine actually looked like until I was standing in the doorway of it, and even then, it didn't look like much. A round room, dim lighting, a single chair in the center. No restraints this time. Nothing holding me there except the contract I'd signed and the brother waiting for me to finish what I'd started. No physical contact required for this phase, Sene said, her voice carrying through a small speaker built into the chair itself, rather than a wall somewhere far away. Everything from here forward happens inside your own mind. We provide the input. Your mind provides the rest. Sounds friendly, I said, sitting down anyway, because 4 hours of not sleep hadn't given me a better plan than the one I'd had since I boarded a shuttle off Earth's surface 3 months ago. Finish it. Get Caleb his medicine, whatever it cost. The lights dimmed further, and a soft hum built somewhere beneath the floor, low enough to feel in my teeth rather than hear with my ears. Beginning phase 4, Senna said, and something in her voice had gone tight, like she was reading lines she didn't fully agree with. The room didn't change first. I did. A weight settled over my chest, slow and total, like someone had quietly replaced the air in the room with something heavier, something that pressed down instead of filling lungs the way air was supposed to. I recognized the shape of it immediately. Even before any image appeared, even before any sound, it was the specific, familiar gravity of a very bad day arriving early, uninvited, certain of its welcome. Then the wall in front of me dissolved into a screen, and Caleb's face filled it. Not a real transmission. I knew that, somewhere underneath the part of me that started shaking the second I saw him. I knew it the way you know a nightmare is a nightmare even while you're still inside it, which is to say, not well enough to stop your body from reacting like it's real. Ren. The screen's Caleb said, his voice pitched exactly right, exactly like him, down to the small rasp he got when he hadn't had water in a few hours. They said you weren't coming back. That's not him, I said out loud, mostly for my own benefit. That's not real. It feels real, Sene's voice said, quiet, almost apologetic. That's the design. The screen flickered through images I hadn't given anyone permission to use. Caleb in a hospital bed, smaller than he should have been. A monitor beeping somewhere off to the side at a rhythm too slow to be reassuring. I knew, logically, clearly, that no real footage of my brother existed anywhere in this station's systems. I knew they'd built this entirely out of whatever scraps of biographical data I'd given during intake, woven together by something designed specifically to find the shape of my worst fear and wear it perfectly. Knowing didn't stop my hands from clenching into fists hard enough to hurt. He's not real, I said again, louder this time, more for the room than for myself. The screen shifted, a different image. A version of Caleb sitting alone in a waiting room, no Ren beside him, the chairs around him all empty, his small hands drumming against his knee the way they always did when he got nervous, except there was nobody there to notice, nobody there to tell him it would be okay, because I hadn't made it back. Something in my chest cracked, sharp and sudden, a feeling I didn't have a clean word for, something between grief and rage that didn't know yet which direction it wanted to go. You left him, the screen Caleb said, and his voice had gone smaller. Younger, exactly the pitch he'd had at 8 years old asking why the power kept going out. You left him for this. I didn't leave anyone, I said, and my voice had changed too, gone rougher, lower, something hardening underneath the words. I'm doing this for him. This is for him. He doesn't know that, the screen said. He just knows you're gone. I stood up out of the chair, fists still clenched, breathing hard, and for one long, terrible second, I felt the floor open up beneath the version of me that had been holding everything together since hour one. Felt the cold pull of an idea that wasn't quite a thought yet, just a shape, just the suggestion that maybe none of it had been worth anything. Maybe I'd traded everything for nothing. Maybe the math I'd been doing since the cold room had been wrong from the very first number. Then, underneath the grief, something else arrived, something I knew better, something that had gotten me through worse rooms than this one. Anger came up sweet and familiar, an old coat I knew the pockets of. I put it on without deciding to. It steadied my knees before I even noticed they'd stopped shaking. "You're not him," I said, and my voice had gone flat now, certain, the kind of certain that doesn't leave room for negotiation. "You're a guess, a really good guess, built out of things I told a stranger during an intake interview. But you don't know what his laugh sounds like when he's actually trying not to laugh at something he shouldn't. You don't know that he hums when he's scared instead of going quiet. You got the shape of him, you didn't get him." The screen flickered, just slightly, like something underneath the image had hesitated. "This isn't real," I said again, and this time I said it to the room, to the engine, to whoever or whatever had built this thing to find the exact spot where a mind gives up. And I'm not giving up, so you'd better have something else, because this isn't working. The screen dissolved. A new image replaced it almost instantly, faster this time, like the system had decided to escalate rather than retreat. A version of the storm cellar from when I was 8, except wrong, twisted, the ceiling already collapsed instead of just groaning. My mother's voice calling out from somewhere underneath rubble that didn't exist anywhere, except inside whatever profile this machine had built of my deepest fears. I felt my stomach drop. I let it drop. I didn't fight that part, but I kept my feet planted, kept my breathing counted in 4s, and watched the image with my jaw set instead of my knees buckling. "Good guess again," I said, voice rough but steady. "Still a guess." The cellar dissolved, and for a moment the room held nothing at all, just dim gray light and my own ragged breathing. Then a new image built itself slowly across the wall, different in kind from the others. Not my mother, not Caleb, not anything from the storm cellar or the hospital room. A council chamber. Rows of seats filled with shapes in the uniforms of a dozen different worlds, none of them human, all of them looking down at a single empty chair in the center. "Subject 8, a voice said from the image, cold and procedural, not unlike Voss's. "Diagnostic complete. Classification. Hostile origin species. Threat designation confirmed." I watched my own absence get discussed in a room I'd never been allowed inside, watched a version of the future where everything I'd survived counted for nothing, where the numbers I'd fought for got read out loud and then filed away under a label that meant Caleb never got his medicine anyway, that none of it had purchased what I thought it had. "That's not how this works," I said, though my voice had gone thinner than I wanted it to. "You don't know how this works," the image replied, in a version of Senny's voice now, flat and distant, nothing like the woman who'd slipped me dried fruit through a panel in the floor. "You never did. You were a data point, nothing more." That one landed harder than the others, not because it scared me, but because some small, exhausted part of me, 90 hours deep into a test that had taken nearly everything I had to give, wondered for half a second if it might be true. I let myself feel that for exactly as long as it took to recognize it, and then I set it down, the way you set down something too heavy to carry the rest of the way. "Maybe I am a data point," I said, "but I'm the one writing the number, not you." The council chamber flickered, hesitated, the way the screen Caleb had hesitated before it, and I understood, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, that the engine wasn't actually getting stronger. It was running out of new shapes to wear. It had reached into every fear I had, and was starting, now, to repeat itself with different paint. The room dimmed further, the weight on my chest pressing harder, images shifting faster now, flickering through every worst version of every fear I'd carried since I was old enough to carry any. Empty hospital rooms, sirens that never stopped, a brother who stopped waiting, a mother's voice calling from somewhere I could never reach in time. Each one hit harder than the last, each one I let land, let hurt, and then stood back up inside anyway, anger doing the steady work grief alone never could. Subject's stress markers are at a level that should have triggered total shutdown 6 minutes ago, Noah said, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite disbelief anymore, something closer to awe. "She's still upright." 2 hours and 11 minutes, Senny said, quiet, like she was reading off a number that didn't feel real even as she said it. "No previous subject has lasted past 1 hour and 40. The images kept coming. I kept standing. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, the engine tried something new. Not fear this time, but absence. A long stretch of total silence and total dark. No images, no sound, nothing at all. Just me, alone. In a black so complete it felt like being erased one piece at a time. I clicked the hairpin against my tooth, twice, the way I always did, and the small sound anchored me in a darkness built specifically to make me forget I had a body at all. "Still here," I said, to nobody, to everybody, to the engine that wanted me gone. "Still here." The dark held for what felt like a very long time, long enough that I lost track of the count I'd been keeping, long enough that the only thing left in the entire world was the small click of metal against my back tooth and the stubborn, steady fact of my own continued breathing. Then, all at once, the lights came back up, soft and ordinary, the chair beneath me solid and real in a way that nothing in that room had felt for hours. Phase 4 complete, Senna said, and her voice broke slightly on the last word, not from sadness, I realized, but from something closer to disbelief turning, finally, into something else entirely. Hour 99, you're at hour 99. I sat there, hollowed out and shaking, and more tired than I had words for, and laughed, a small broken sound that surprised even me. 1 more hour, I said. 1 more hour, she agreed. Is that it? I asked, because some part of me, even after everything, still needed to hear someone else say it out loud before I'd let myself believe it. There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that I started to worry the answer wasn't the one I wanted. Final hour is a standard recovery observation period, Sen said finally. No active testing, just monitoring. Somewhere behind the glass, I heard another voice enter the channel, low and clipped, and recognized it instantly, even through the static of my own exhaustion. 99 hours, he said, not to me, to the room, to whoever else was still awake at that hour, logging numbers onto a screen. No subject in the history of this program has reached 99 hours conscious. Compile the full data set immediately. I want it ready for council transmission before the final hour ends. Director, Sen said, and there was a warning in her voice now, sharp enough to cut through even the haze settling over me. She hasn't completed the diagnostic yet. There's still an hour remaining. There's no scenario where she fails the last hour, Voss said. We both know that. I'd like the report finished before she does, not after. I didn't understand, not fully, not in the state I was in, why that detail mattered so much, why a man who'd spent 4 days trying to break me now seemed almost eager to be the first one to tell the rest of the galaxy that he hadn't managed it. I was too tired to chase the thought all the way down to wherever it led. I let it go, the way I'd learned to let go of things I didn't have the strength left to carry, and focused instead on the small, steady fact of my own breathing. Don't transmit anything yet, Senna said, quieter now, like she was choosing the words carefully, even as she said them. Not until I've reviewed the complete record myself. It's procedure, Voss said. It's my procedure to review first, she said. That hasn't changed regardless of the hour. There was a pause, brief and taut, and then Voss's voice clicked off the channel without another word, the kind of silence that meant the conversation wasn't over so much as postponed. I closed my eyes, hairpin still warm against my ear, and let myself, for the first time in 99 hours, simply sit there and breathe, without counting, without bracing, without anything left to prove except staying exactly as upright as I already was. Hour 100 arrived without fanfare, just a soft chime somewhere in the ceiling and Sene's voice, steadier now than I'd heard it in days. Diagnostic complete, she said. Subject 8, 100 hours, full consciousness maintained throughout. I sat in the small recovery room, the monitoring drone finally powering down and drifting to a corner like it had run out of reasons to hover, and felt the words land somewhere strange in my chest. Not triumph exactly, more like the quiet ache of finally setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you forgot your arms could do anything else. That's it? I asked, because 4 days of bracing for the next bad thing had left me unable to fully believe there wasn't one more waiting just past the door. That's it, Sene said, and this time, when she stepped into the room in person, no glass between us, she didn't look at a readout first. She looked at me. She looked tired too, I realized, in whatever way her species showed it, faint shadows beneath those violet eyes. Her usually careful posture loosened slightly at the shoulders, like she'd been holding herself upright through the same 100 hours I had, just from a different side of the glass. You should rest, she said, properly, this time. Real sleep. In a minute, I said. I want to know what happens now. Something shifted behind her eyes, quick and careful, the kind of look people give you right before they decide how much of the truth to hand over. Now, she said slowly. The council reviews the complete diagnostic record and makes a formal classification of your species. Cooperative, neutral, or hostile, I finished, remembering the council chamber from the engine, the cold procedural voice reading my absence into a permanent record. Threat designation. She didn't ask how I knew the phrase. Maybe she assumed the engine had shown me something close enough. She just nodded, once, slow. Director Voss already has a draft prepared, she said. He intends to submit it the moment I release my full notes. And what do your notes say? She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I started to understand the answer mattered more than the question had let on. Everything, she said finally. Every reaction, every involuntary response. The collapse position during the false alarm, the way you talked yourself out of a hallucination in real time, the way your body chose calm under conditions that should have made calm physically impossible. A pause. Director Voss reads strength as danger. He always has. Every data point I've recorded over the last 4 days is, to him, evidence that your species could become something the Coalition can't control. So don't give it to him, I said. Simple as that. Though I already understood it wasn't simple at all. It's procedure, she said. Full records. Unredacted. Within 6 hours of diagnostic completion. I sat with that, exhaustion pulling at every part of me, and thought about the empty council chamber again, the cold voice reading a verdict that had nothing to do with the 4 days I'd actually survived, and everything to do with how those days could be twisted into a weapon by someone who'd never once asked what any of it had cost me. Caleb, I said instead, because there was only so much weight I could hold at once, and some of it needed to be set down first. Is he already receiving treatment? Sen said, quickly, gently, like she'd been waiting for the question and was relieved to finally have an easy answer to give me. That part of the contract activated the moment you entered Phase 1. It was never contingent on completion. I made certain of that myself, the first day you arrived, before I knew anything about you except your name and your willingness to walk into this station at all. Something in my chest loosened that had been wound tight since before the cold room, since before the shuttle ride off Earth, since longer than I could easily trace back. I put my face in my hands for a moment, not crying, not quite, just breathing. Through the sudden, enormous relief of it, 4 days of bracing finally allowed to unclench. Thank you, I said, when I trusted my voice again. Don't thank me, she said. I only confirmed the contract terms. You're the one who did the rest. I slept after that finally, real sleep, deep and dreamless in a way the last 100 hours hadn't allowed. And when I woke, the light in the room had shifted to something softer. Simulated dusk instead of clinical white. And a tray of actual food sat waiting on the small table beside the bed. Nobody came to explain anything further for a long while. I ate slowly, savoring real flavor after days of foil-wrapped rations, and let my body remember, one small ordinary motion at a time, what it felt like to simply exist without proving anything to anyone. It was Noah who found me eventually, slipping into the room with the same careful hesitance he'd shown through the panel in the floor days earlier. Except now there was no wall between us, no speaker carrying his voice from somewhere unseen. You're a legend down in the control room, he said, sitting in the chair across from me without quite meeting my eyes at first, like he wasn't sure what the etiquette was for talking to someone who'd just broken every chart his station had ever produced. Nobody can stop talking about it. Is that good or bad? I asked. Depends who you ask, he admitted. Half the staff thinks the Coalition just found its most valuable ally in a century. The other half is scared out of their minds. And you? He considered the question longer than I expected, turning it over with the same careful attention he'd given my biometric readouts for 4 straight days. I think you're just a person who had a really bad week and didn't quit, he said finally. I don't know why that has to mean anything more complicated than that, but I don't think Director Voss sees it the same way. I didn't have a good answer for that, so I didn't try to give him one. I just sat there, slowly working through the rest of the food on the tray, listening to the quiet hum of the station around us. The same sound that had carried me through 4 impossible days, now strangely comforting in its ordinariness. Where's Dr. Seni? I asked eventually. Noah's expression shifted, something careful and a little worried crossing it. Her office. She's been there since you fell asleep. Hasn't come out. I didn't ask him to explain further. Something in the way he said it told me I already understood more than he'd put into words, the same way I'd understood things from Seni herself, without her ever quite finishing a sentence. Noah left not long after, called away by some small task that pulled him back toward the control room, and I'd barely finished setting the empty tray aside when the door opened again without a knock. Voss stood in the frame, taller than I'd pictured from his voice alone, his uniform crisp in a way that suggested he hadn't spent the last 4 days losing sleep over anyone. Subject 8, he said, the same flat label he'd used since hour 1, like he hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared to notice, that the rest of his station had stopped using it somewhere around hour 50. Ren, I said, since we're on a first-name basis now, apparently. He didn't smile. I didn't expect him to. I wanted to see you in person, he said, stepping into the room, hands clasped behind his back, studying me the way you study a structural fault in a building you're trying to decide whether to condemn. The numbers are extraordinary. I find myself curious whether the person attached to them is as remarkable as the data suggests, or whether 4 days of careful procedure simply produced a very convincing illusion of calm. Pretty sure the readouts already answered that for you, I said. Heart rate doesn't really know how to lie. No, he agreed. It doesn't, which is precisely what concerns me. He moved closer, just slightly, enough that I felt the deliberate weight of it. Your species nearly destroyed itself before we ever arrived. Wars, famine, a planet half poisoned by its own hands before anyone outside it ever stepped in. And from the wreckage of all that, you produce someone who can withstand 4 days of total psychological collapse without breaking. I don't find that reassuring. I find it instructive. Instructive of what? Of what your species might be capable of, he said, once it stops surviving itself and starts looking outward instead. I sat with that for a moment, tired in a way that went deeper than the 100 hours behind me, and found, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, the same steady anger that had carried me through the despair engine still sitting patient and ready, waiting to be useful one more time. You watched me for 4 days, I said. You saw every reaction my body had, every reflex, every old scar I didn't choose to have. You never once saw me hurt anyone in that room, not the engine, not your test, not even when it gave me every reason it could invent to want to. I held his gaze, steady, the way I'd learned to hold a lot of things steady that wanted badly to shake. You're not afraid of what I might do, Director. You're afraid of what you wouldn't be able to stop, if I ever decided to. Those aren't the same fear, even if they feel that way from where you're standing. For the first time since I'd arrived at that station, something genuine moved behind his expression, brief and unreadable, gone before I could fully name it. The Council will decide what to do with that distinction, he said finally, and turned to leave, pausing once more in the doorway without looking back. For what it's worth, Subject 8, you survived something nothing should have survived. I don't dispute that. I simply intend to make certain the rest of the galaxy understands precisely what that means, in every direction it might cut. He left, and the door sealed quietly behind him, and I sat there a while longer, letting the conversation settle, before I finally pushed myself up off the bed to go find the one person on that station who'd spent 4 days watching the same numbers Voss had, and somehow arrived at an entirely different conclusion. I found her office 2 corridors down, the door slightly ajar, a thin line of warm light spilling out into the otherwise dim hallway. I knocked once, lightly, and when no answer came, pushed the door open anyway. She wasn't at her desk. She stood near a small recycling chute set into the far wall, the kind every station used for waste disposal, the kind that fed straight down into an incinerator core somewhere beneath the deck. In her hands she held a thick stack of paper. Actual paper. Rare enough in a station built around digital systems that I understood immediately it had to matter. Had to be something she'd chosen, deliberately, to keep outside the official network the whole time. I recognized her handwriting on the topmost page, dense and careful, covering every inch of the margins. Leora, I said, using her given name for the first time, surprising even myself with how naturally it came out. She turned, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. The stack of paper trembled slightly in her hands, not from weakness, I understood, but from the particular kind of effort it takes to do something you've decided is right, even while every procedural instinct you've built a career around screams against it. These are my personal observations, she said finally. Everything official is already filed, exactly as procedure requires. Heart rate, cortisol levels, timestamps, the numbers Voss needs for his report are already where they're supposed to be. And those? These are the rest of it, she said. The parts numbers can't hold. The way you talked a hallucination back into the wall instead of letting it win. The way you reached for a hairpin like it mattered more than your own oxygen. And the way watching you do that taught me something about why it actually did. The exact sound your voice made when you said "still here," into a darkness built to erase you. She looked down at the pages like they weighed considerably more than paper should. These are the parts that would make Voss's argument unstoppable. Not because they prove you're dangerous. Because they prove exactly how much more there is to fear in something this resilient. If resilience is the only thing you've trained yourself to be afraid of. I didn't tell her not to do it. Some decisions aren't yours to make for someone else, even when they're about you. She turned back to the chute, fed the pages in slowly, one careful stack at a time, and pressed the small release that sent them down into the incinerator core below. I heard the faint, distant sound of the burn cycle starting somewhere beneath the deck. Nothing dramatic, just a soft mechanical hum doing exactly what it was built to do. I burned 100 hours of irreplaceable data, she said quietly, almost to herself, because the alternative was teaching an entire alliance how to be afraid of a girl who just wanted to go home to her brother. We stood there together for a while, neither of us saying much else, watching the small indicator light above the chute blink from active to complete, the last of her handwritten record gone now except for whatever lived on in the two of us who'd actually been in the room for it. What happens to me now? I asked eventually. Officially. Officially, you're classified pending council review, she said. Unofficially, I think you're about to become the most carefully watched, quietly respected anomaly this program has ever produced. Voss will push his version of events regardless. But he won't have everything anymore. Just the numbers. Not the proof of what they cost you, or what you chose to do with them. I thought about that for a long moment, standing in a dim office 2 corridors from a recovery room, 4 days and 100 hours behind me. A brother, somewhere on a healing bed I hadn't seen in 3 months and would, soon, finally get to see again. Numbers don't tell anybody who I actually am, I said. No, Sene agreed. They never do. That's precisely the problem with most diagnostics. They measure everything except the only thing that actually matters. I left her office a while later, walking slow through corridors I'd only ever experienced through fear and exhaustion before, noticing for the first time the small, ordinary details of a station I'd be living in for who knew how long. Handprints worn smooth on certain railings, a faint hum of distant engines, the particular quality of starlight pouring through a viewport near the end of the hall, unfiltered and endless in a way no window back home had ever offered. I stopped there, in front of the viewport, and looked out at the slow-turning dark. Somewhere beyond it, a small blue planet I couldn't see from this angle, but knew was there anyway, the way you know a person is still breathing in the next room even with the door closed. I reached up and touched the hairpin behind my ear, clicked it once against my back tooth, an old habit that had carried me through 4 days nobody expected me to survive. Caleb would ask about all this someday, once he was strong enough to ask about anything beyond the next breath, the next small victory of simply getting better. I'd tell him the whole story eventually. The cold room, the pressure, the alarm that sent me straight back to a road outside a city that didn't exist anymore, the engine that built his face out of guesses and got it wrong in all the ways that mattered most. For now, I just stood there, watching stars I'd never learned the names of, breathing slow and steady and entirely on my own terms for the first time in 100 hours, and let myself, finally, simply rest. Somewhere below the deck, the last of Leora Sen's handwritten notes had already turned to ash. Somewhere far behind me, on a small blue planet nobody on this station had ever once bothered to ask the actual name of, a boy with small hands and a habit of drumming his fingers against his knee was, for the first time in longer than either of us could count, finally going to be okay. That was the only number that had ever really mattered.